Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our members and guests. My name is Stephen Longmire, and I'm this year's president of the DIA. Due to the global pandemic, we've opted to continue to hold our meetings, but in a virtual session, and this is our 5th webinar. The two key mandates for the Digital Imaging Association are to provide education and networking opportunities for our members. At this time, we have to forego networking for everyone's safety, but I hope you find the educational aspect worthwhile, and we do look forward to your feedback. Our membership is comprised of pre-press, printers, packaging converters, designers, advertisers, print buyers, equipment and consumable manufacturers, and vendors. If you're joining us today as a guest, please consider joining the Digital Imaging Association. Today's session is an example of the high caliber meetings that we run. If you'd like more information on membership, please contact either myself or Mark McLeod at 416-254-4941 or Marg, M-A-R-G, at digitalimagingassociation.com. Like most trade associations today, financial stability does not come from membership revenues alone. And so we turn to the vendors and suppliers to support our goals as an association. We're honored to continue to receive the support and recognition of the DIA's contribution to the growth and development of the graphic imaging science industry from the following companies. Our platinum sponsors are Canon, EFI, HP, Konica Minolta, and Spicers. Our gold sponsors are Adobe, Fujifilm, Graphics Canada, and Heidelberg. We ask you to please consider these companies and their demonstrated support for the industry when you're making your future purchasing decisions. Technology for this webinar today has been generously provided by HP. The topic for today's webinar is Gambling with Future Technology, How Technology and Applications Will Impact Your Business. A presentation by Dr. Mark Bohan, Director of Color Solutions, Konica Minolta Business Solutions. The moderator today is Stephen Longmire, Sydney Stone, Print Finishing Equipment. I've joined Sydney Stone in November of 2020. As mentioned, currently president of the DIA after spending 13.5 years as associate publisher of Print Action Magazine. Dr. Mark Bohan, Director of Color Solutions, Konica Minolta Business Solutions. Dr. Bohan is an acknowledged expert on the application of all print technologies, their business impact, and the optimization of production workflow and print operations. Working with many processes and new technologies, he has carried out extensive technical and business assessments for both users and manufacturers as to their impact on business operations. His work has culminated in over 450 publications, invited presentations, and press articles. In his current role, he is responsible for color solutions for Konica Minolta Business Solutions, including digital toner, inkjet, cloud solutions, color management, and G7 implementations. He serves on multiple boards and committees while also participating in standards worldwide. Konica Minolta Business Solutions, a little history. What started as a camera company in 1873 has evolved into an international organization, paving the way in print, software, IT services, and cloud solutions. From Rokusaburo Sugura, founding Konica in 1873, selling photographic materials in Tokyo, to the 2003 merger of Konica and Minolta. Konica Minolta has always been at the forefront of transformation. Today, Konica Minolta is an international organization heading up its Canadian headquarters in Mississauga, Ontario. At this point, I'd like to turn over the presentation to Dr. Mark Bohan.
Thank you for that great introduction, Stephen. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be able to speak today. And really what I wanted to try and do was to focus on technologies and solutions as they're shaping the future of print and where we're going with those solutions. I'm going to talk about a host of different areas. I'm going to talk about a host of different products. And, I generally tend to, there are lots of great solutions from the different manufacturers out there. And, I'd really encourage you to go and look at the different manufacturers as to when you're looking at particular areas. just going to move the slide thing out of the way. So to me, this is a sort of a really exciting time. It's one that I'm really glad that I'm in the industry. I did my PhD initially in atomic energy and finished that working in the UK, and decided that printing was actually a much better industry to be in. And it's continued to get better. It's continued to evolve, and new opportunities are coming up continually. And that's one of the things that really excites me, is looking at those new opportunities, how businesses can transform, leveraging those, but making sure, as always, there's a business case behind everything that we're doing with that. So what I'd like to do is sort of just give an overview. I spent my time initially in the US working for GATF, the Graphic Arts Technical Foundation, and then Printing Industries of America. And to me, it's really critical that we understand some of the economics, because without a business case for something, then we're not going to be moving forward with that. Really, when we're talking about technologies that are shaping the future, to me, the Industry 4.0 is one of those things that's really being one of those underpinning areas that's helping us shape where we're going forward, different technologies that we're leveraging. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And with respect to the printing industry, that's one of the things you see, or I see a lot when I read about this. It's about manufacturing. It's about car manufacturing or electronics manufacturing. There are some very specific things to the print industry. And then really going through, talking about some of the different print manufacturing processes, the way in which I see some of those are changing, how they're impacting how we're running the business, talking about some of the workflow. So it's not about hardware, it's about workflow, because it's about being efficient, driving profitability, and then really try and bring it together with some closing thoughts. I commend everybody that's here on this session, and I would sort of encourage with what Stephen has said about joining the associations. That education is one of the underpinning things when you're looking at moving businesses forward, is looking for those fresh perspectives, looking at the different areas. That's one of the reasons I get so involved with some of the associations such as TAGA, some of the standards work that we do within the US, you do within Canada, as to actually where is the industry going and how is it going to impact what we're going to do. So if we take a step back, we all know that we're under exceedingly large amounts of pressure in our business. We have a continual push, our consumables, our components, we have price pressures on those. From the customer side, we have price pressures. So we're trying to balance all of that together. But I think what's, to me, is really important to say is, what do we actually have? What's the one thing that we can do? And we have time. That's what we sell. We sell time. We have time in our manufacturing facility to produce goods. And so how can we do that in the most efficient and cost-effective way as we go through? So if we look on from the economic side, there's been a host of different studies carried out. I happen to use the PIA ratio ones here. What they've done is a great investigation into a full cross-section of the industry. And when we look at those, if we look at those top 25% of those companies that participate, they're running typically around a 10% profit margin. It will vary depending upon the industry, but typically they're going to be 7 to 8% above the average. The challenge is that when we look at the challenges, then they're running at either a break even or a loss. And that's built from the other 75%. So that's not the bottom 25%. That's the average of if you take that top 25% out. So really what we're seeing is that those profit leaders are much more profitable. And so why is it? And that's where I spent a lot of time working with the economics team to really go in and drive as to what's going on with that. And where are some of the areas that we're seeing significant differences? One is the way in which they've looked at their manufacturing costs, and they've reduced and driven down those manufacturing costs. Critically, they've also increased their productivity. We get paid for producing material, not for preparing it. And so it's how do we increase that productivity? They're understanding and following their business metrics. And I think that's where we're seeing with Industry 4.0, we're getting a much better insight into what is going on with that. As with today's session, they're continuing with that lifelong learning. And in certain cases, they developed particular niches that they're working in. So one of the things that they looked at was looking at the profitability breakdown. And this one is from a typical commercial printer in the US, and really breaks down the operating profits to being 2.5%. But we'll then work on, okay, what's it to do with the paper, my administrative, my selling expenses, my factory payroll. And then really, how can I improve my profitability? How can I improve what I'm doing from a business perspective? One of the interesting things when we looked at that was actually looking at capital equipment growth as well. So when we're looking at bringing in equipment, how does that impact it? If we've got a $1 million investment, then we need to increase our sales by $1 million to offset that. Not necessarily true, because we're going to build it across the whole of that area. So what you're really looking at when you're comparing a lot of this is you're also building in that productivity, because as you increase that productivity, then the price differentials when you're looking at equipment will minimize, and it's effectively about 1/3 of the difference. So you can take a difference in equipment price and actually then relate that to where you would have to increase your productivity by. So that's really, to me, it's about going in and understanding the metrics. There's a link on the bottom. This is actually a publicly available report, so it's something that you can reach out and just go and purchase. You don't actually, in this particular case, need to be a member of that was out of printing.org. Again, supported by the vendor contributions in the industry. So if we look at Industry 4.0, what are we going to do? Let's take a step back and go into the printing industry. And really, what are we talking about with this? Really the first, and it's really about those different industrial revolutions. The first one was all around mechanization, utilizing steam power, and a lot of that really going into the newspaper type industry. So you'll see a lot of this was driven in that newspaper industry. Later in the 1800s, it was again in newspaper, but was looking at mass production, leveraging electric power for drive shafts. And we were discussing the challenges that we're seeing in the US currently with electric power going to different locations at the moment with the weather. Later in was really bringing in that computers and automation. So we started in the late 60s to start to see with scanners, with step and repeat machines, we started to see that automation and computers come in. What we're looking at really with the Industry 4.0 is looking at what's called cyber physical systems. So it's looking at that full connectivity between the machine and the data as it's going through, looking at the automated factories. Many of the discussions that you'll see is talking about smart factories. How do we automate what we're going to do? One of the reasons I moved over to the United States in 2004 was to actually head up the JDF certification program. And it's really looking at how we can utilize using standards that information being passed. How can we leverage cloud solutions as we're going through with this? That sounds great, but what does it really all mean? And to me, This is really the 9 areas for which you're going to see Industry 4.0. We have some big drivers that really are important from within the printing perspective as we're going through with this. Firstly, we're looking at systems integration. So how do we allow those systems to integrate together? Too much of the times we've got proprietary systems. As I say, I got involved with standards early on, and in the standards development really initiated because we actually wanted to pass file formats between different systems, and we didn't have a way in which we could do that. So how do we do the systems integration? This is what's going to drive. How do we then use big data and analytics? So how, when we've got this integration, we've got analytics that we can use, how do we actually go in and look at that data? We're clearly leveraging the Internet of Things and the cloud. Security is a critical thing that we see, and then leveraging simulation and virtualization actually in a lot of the training and the operational parts of what we're going to do. Also then looking at where we can use autonomy with robotics, or technologies such as augmented reality and additive manufacturing. But really what we're looking, I would say, is those first 6 is the key in what we're doing with this as we move forward. And it really does all become about the data. So it's how can we leverage that data from a technology perspective. From the finance and HR, this is one of the things when we're looking at data. Data tends to be in silos. We have production data, we have sales data, we have customer data, we have some operational. Many of the times, those systems will not communicate with each other. So we have data in different silos, but really to be able to leverage it, what we need to be able to do is to combine those data sources into a way that we can accurately leverage that data and make informed decisions. It's not a decision based upon the gut feeling of somebody. The data always comes to the key when you can do that. My first role was on a web offset press, and we collected data from that press for 3 months. I had one of my colleagues, one of my students, do some very basic analysis. The first slide I put up just said how long the press was turning over for. We stopped that meeting very immediately, and a board meeting was called instead where we could go through that, because this was the first time that they'd looked at the data. It was reliant on what people were saying and who was shouting the loudest. So data will become a key as we go through this. So if we look at the printing processes themselves, again, with the scope of this presentation, we could have spent all day talking about this. So I'm going to pick out some of the areas that I think are important. And the emissions are nothing against those particular technologies. I think, within the printing processes itself, if I take offset as an example, it's continued to evolve, and it's all really become about being productive. It's moved from much more of a craft into a smart print factory. It can be whether I can talk about Heidelberg, I can talk about Komori, we can look at Konica. They all have a lot of the same technologies around there, but it's about that automation and being able to leverage the upfront data so that the presses can actually be running, producing sellable product as quickly as possible. So it's looking at that automatic transfer of data to the press. That becomes an absolute crux of how we can get that data onto the press, leveraging that data so that we can do presets. So we can look at minimizing changes between jobs. Once we're running, fantastic. But what we need to be able to do is leverage the technology so that we know what our next job is. This would happen to be a Komori image on the right. And, in that particular case, one of the things that they really focus on is actually changing the ink ducting between jobs so that they can quickly and accurately get up to acceptable sellable color in the minimal sheets, 20 or 30 in this particular case. Trying to minimize the operator intervention so that the operator there is, as the Heidelberg would say, is push to stop. They're interacting when something needs to be done. And we're also using that scheduling optimization. And that is really critical when we're looking at this, and we have changeover times, is looking how we can leverage that scheduling. So we're understanding how the scheduling impacts the productivity of the system as a whole, not just of the running during that particular run. We consider the make readies. We can configure the job end. We also then look at the downstream processes so that those can all be optimized. So we're not introducing those added times later on. So it's looking at it as a complete perspective. So this would be a typical example when we're really leveraging that and we're scheduling. So this was a 24-hour period on a press, looking at 134 make readies. So scheduling clearly becomes a critical part in that, but then looking at those transitions between jobs and looking at taking seconds out of a particular operation. If you're doing it 134 times, then you need to be able to take that out. And also looking at running optimally. So in this case, even though these particular jobs were only 150 sheets, the press is running still at the full rated speed of the press. So being able to get that productivity up and to be able to drive everything that's going on. This comes to looking at the scheduling here becomes absolutely critical, so that we're scheduling so that we can do these minimal make readies. We're also scheduling that in this particular case, actually the biggest problem was not the printing, but was actually the plate supply. So you have to feed the plates to the press in this particular case, and doing 24 make readies in 1 hour really is something that's all about the workflow of getting the plates to the press, and then managing the workflow throughout the rest of the day to actually be able to produce all of those materials. On the digital printing side of things, it's continuing to make inroads, and both the EP and inkjet have got a lot of opportunities, and we're seeing that growth that's going in there. The number of those digital pages continue to grow. Again, though, in this particular case, it's looking about how do we automate those processes? So how can we effectively leverage the technology from Paul, who's running this? How can we leverage the HP technology, for instance, to be the most effective, so that we're not waiting on the particular job, or we've got the workflow in place such that when it comes through, we're not slowing the press down because we have that highly complex personalized data that we're actually driving the press with. We're seeing a lot more with added value from substrates and additional coatings, and those continues to evolve as we're going through, and building in security features as we go through with that. I think one of the interesting things when we're looking at these technologies is the way in which the press controls really now have got a much more of a democratization with regard to print quality and print color. So they're now very highly automated within press setup and linearization, so that the press continually goes back to that same known condition. So you're not chasing your color management per se with that. Looking at controlling that automatic register in line. So again, you're maintaining that print quality as it's going through. And these are user activities. They're not the requirement of having to bring in service technicians to be able to do these steps. So again, what they're looking at is increasing that uptime of the particular press. We're seeing a lot more increased sheet size and media flexibility. As I say, we're seeing that automated color. So when we're running towards a G7, a Grackle 2013, for instance, then the press can automatically maintain that. We're looking at automated defect detection systems. So again, not only will it detect those defects, we can define exactly where we want to monitor those barcodes. But now on many of the different presses, and this is general commercial EP type presses, these can be incorporated, and if a defect is detected, will automatically be ejected and the piece reprinted within the particular sequence as we're going through. The other thing that we're seeing within this is the use of embellishments, and it continues to be a voyage of discovery. And I would say the embellishments again are moving into a much more democratized way. What is happening now is the technologies are robust, allowing the different embellishment technologies to be employed, whether printing within an analog solution or in the digital solution. And there are different embellishments that can be leveraged in any of those. I would love that we could get the day that we can get back together again. This is actually my favorite session that I ever talk about is embellishment. And I have probably 300 different examples of embellishment. And it becomes an interactive session. It's not one that's one that you listen very much. It's that we touch, we feel, we see what can be done with the different technologies. And my colleagues even have to remind me that I need to put our technologies in there at times. On the offset side of things, we have very great solutions that are available. If you look at we're looking at reticulation coatings, we're looking at textures, we're looking at the way in which we can leverage those different glosses. The technologies have got much more robust as we're going through this. We can get the different varnishes that we can apply that will give us a wet feel look. Some of them that I've seen some great examples from Komori, Heidelberg, and Konica Minolta, and they'll each leverage different areas. But I would really highly recommend looking at some of these to see how they can be done. I spent a lot of time when I was at GATF and then at Heidelberg actually producing many of these different types of examples. One of the other ways we can look at the differentiation will be when we're using the inkjet, that we can build up those textured impacts. We can leverage technologies such as the thermochromics. This was a nice challenge. Actually, we supported the company that was doing this in one of my old jobs, and the blue's nice and blue because we got rid of the misting. And when we got rid of the misting on the press, we doubled the density that was actually being produced. So it's again looking at that whole system. We can look at technologies such as thermoforming. One of the organizations that I'm heavily involved with would be TAGA, Technical Association of the Graphic Arts. And this is actually a student journal. So from the Canadian side, we always have a team that come down from Ryerson University. They bring some great and interesting examples down. And I would highly encourage, if you get a chance to look at any of the journals that they've produced, they're pushing the envelope. Is it always perfect? It's not always perfect, but it gives you those ideas. And that's really why we get heavily involved with that, is looking at where we're going to see those different ideas. And then, we've got the digital embellishments, whether we're looking at, the things like the Scodics, the MGIs, where we can look at selective areas, we can look at gloss, we can look at metallics that are coming in there. We're seeing some interesting things now where we're going towards single manufacturing facilities. So we can actually print and embellish all in a particular one particular press. And those technologies are going to be there, and they're going to have a number of applications for which they're very well suited. Other situations will be that we'll do it in a number of different steps, and it really depends upon that business mix that people have got as we're going through with that. Packaging, we've all seen, is great, and this is what we see now: empty shops without people in, unfortunately. Hopefully we'll be going back to all be in there much more, but that packaging is showing a big change what's going on at the moment, and really one of the biggest ones is from the sustainability perspective. We've seen this a lot, is really going from that linear approach where we're going to make something, we'll use it, and then we discard it, the throwaway technology, where we want much more of a circular that will either reuse or recycle. And so this is impacting how we're producing things, the materials that we're actually going to use. So I'm actually in the middle of testing some film replacement. So it's a board, it's a paper-based material that's there to replace some plastics. So we're looking at that from a packaging perspective on some of the label applications and some other areas that we're looking at. So within that circular economy, it's really driving in five main things. We're looking at to reduce. So we're looking at the design structures and the manufacturing so that we can lower material, energy use, and waste footprints. And we're going to look, as to that waste that we can reduce. This is where some of those technologies really help us understand and look at exactly how we're using that. Once we can start to use the metrics, then we can understand how things are happening. We're going to reuse, offering subscriptions rather than things being a single one-off purchase. And we're seeing that on the technology side. We've seen it for a long time on the software side of things. We're now starting to even see that on hardware. Some very expensive pieces of hardware, though, where it's looking much more at a subscription basis. The other one is that, within that design, that those products can be much easier repaired and manufactured. And then looking how we can turn byproducts into new products or adding recycling content. And then substituting some of those finite materials that we've got. So it's really looking at the whole of that. And this is what's driving a lot of where we are with packaging, one of the big growth areas that we see within our industry. When we look at those drivers, there's really four main drivers that are pushing this forward. One to do with the climate change and the commitment that countries have to reduce their greenhouse gases. There's a UN 2030 agenda looking at sustainable goals. And so that's also driving what's going on and how we're going this. Clearly, the way in which regulations and policy are applied. We have producer responsibilities to items, and I continue to get involved with that in the US side of things. And then we also have the consumer activism, the impact of programs such as the Blue Planet to really refocus the effort on reducing certain materials and how we can move into a much better area. So within this, some of the areas that we've seen is, the use of reusables. And I think post-COVID, we'll look at that increasing. It's been challenged at the time. Leveraging the design so that we can use less materials within there. A lot of work is going on the new polymers so that we can have more effective barriers. We've got less environmental impact. One of the things that we need to work on with that is the way in which it interacts with our printing environments. We've seen a lot of the removal of plastics, how products are structured. We see the Heineken can on the right-hand side. These have now got board connectors in instead. So we're looking at changing how we do things. This was on the BBC website last week. Oh, actually, it was over the weekend, looking at trialing paper bottles and looking at how we can use paper-based products for water and for fizzy drinks. And fizzy drinks, i.e. they mean beer, but how it can actually sustain the pressures, and then also then looking at new recycling processes as to how we can do this. One of the important things when we're looking at the packaging is looking at that risk management. This is a very old slide, as in screen grab, but remains exactly the same. And it's really looking, at, from the CPG side of things, is looking at that complete supply chain risk. And so how does it all sit in the business? This was actually from Italy. It was a baby milk scare. The two things you never affect are children and pets. Those are the two most difficult, the ones that will get the biggest outcry. Within Italy, when products come off the shelf, they're taken off by the police, not your staff. And it is a disastrous PR marketing. He's also looking at way in which the food safety, the toxicology is done, and he's looking from a global perspective in a lot of cases as well. So, one of the challenges that you've got is that we have products that are sold in multiple different locations, and is looking at those global perspectives and those global regulations, and at times making the business decision that while it may be legal to have traces of a particular chemical in Brazil, for instance. So this was actually with a baby food. They're not on the Nestle list. They're not legal in Europe. The independent testing lab managed to find this out, publish for the CPG, and that they were poisoning the children in Brazil with food that they wouldn't be acceptable in Europe. A 95% reduction in sales overnight. So this is where the CPG side of things is really understanding that risk management. And when we're looking at the packaging, that's something really critical to be aware of. So what I'd like to look at now is talk a little bit and sort of pull it together on some workflow and some color side of things. Workflow really is the core for what we're going to do. It's getting it done. At the end of the time, we want less touch points as we're going through. Every time we have a touch point, we have an error point. I was working with a company, and one of their people was actually, that was all his job, was reducing these touch points. We were having an automation meeting. He was asked the question, "You're doing yourself out of a job by doing this automation." And he went, "Yes, I am. But if I don't do this, I'm doing the company out of a job, out of existence." That person is retrained, is now working in sales, having a fantastic job, and the company is increasing its profitability as it's going through. Is then looking at where we're tracking, where we've got that accuracy and that speed of billing. As I say, there are many islands of automation, and it's being able how we can pass that information across in a non-proprietary way so that we don't have to create custom communications, so that if Paul and myself, our companies both need to talk to EFI, we want a single standard communication protocol so that we don't have to write different ones. Likewise, EFI don't have to write two different ones, whether they're coming to HP or to Konica. That passing of information can be problematic. And also within those different areas, there are different objectives of what people are wanting. A production solution does not really care too much about a finance. An ERP cares about finance. And so it's how do you make sure that all that information appropriate to both sides is actually being passed as we go through. So we went really around that MIS and ERP looking at how we build it, we only still have a sort of 60% penetration within the industry of those solutions, and nearly every piece of data I've looked at says that probably only a third of those are actually well implemented. The others are providing some information. Connectivity is really the key on this. Interestingly, it's been good to look at how AI's come in. So spent quite a lot of time looking at AI and how the AI is impacting our industry. And this is actually one of those ones that can be a challenge. Because when we're looking at, MIS, ERPs, we don't have a lot of interactions of transactions on a daily basis. We have a lot, but it's not in the thousands. So to be able to get the AI to work effectively and that we're comfortable with it is a challenge, just because of the amount of training. But if we look at some of the large web to print solutions, so I read Flyer Alarm were in the press this morning. Flyer Alarm is one of those companies that are looking at leveraging AI actually within their pricing models, as well as how they distribute the amount of jobs, because they have that volume. So they've got the volume, they can leverage the AI. Critically though, it's about that business intelligence, and it's driving those two sets of data. We've got production data that tells us how we did, tells us what we did. And we've got sales data. What are we selling? The key is to combine those two, and they're generally in two completely different silos. I've worked with companies where they have, one of their senior staff says, I spend 2 to 3 hours every day looking at these two silos and trying to get the data, trying to see how the data is interacting. And that's where we're seeing much more of a focus for how can we do these two disparate systems connected, so that I can understand the profitability. Production data is really about how we're producing, but what we want to be is to be profitable with that production data. So how can I go in and really marry those two particular systems? And we're starting to see the leverage of that in the cloud to actually build systems that can be done to do that. The large companies are looking at doing it themselves, but they are becoming, leveraging things such as Microsoft Power BI, actually creating tools that people can easily leverage as they're going through. That web to print is continuing to grow. There was a very nice report done by the Association of Print Technologies, came out about a year ago. Interestingly, the top 6 have more than $1 billion in US dollars in sales. They're driving on the purchasing, but what they have is they have a highly efficient way of passing that data through as it's coming in. One of the things they like to talk about was the person who actually did this analysis. It was commissioned by Association for Print Technologies. It was done by Smithers Smithers as they are now. And first person I ever worked with in the industry. But really looking at the separation in that print buying process when we're doing that. As I said, we're seeing AI models being developed to support in that pricing, so that we can really leverage what they've got going on. When they look at the marketplace, they're looking, and this was pre-COVID, so but they were looking at something like a $7 billion growth from 2018 through to 2023. Interestingly, when I'm looking at this, what I want to know is, okay, I've got that growth, but photo products is staying, we're growing, it's reduced in percentage, but generally it's going to grow because I know I've got a $7 million growth, $7 billion growth. The interestingness is looking at where we have those growths. So we've been talking about packaging, seeing a growth of 4.4% in that packaging market on top of that percentage growth anyway. We're seeing display and signage. We've seen a lot on the textile side of things, and then in the way in which we're going to use labels as well. So that's where they're seeing that we're going to see this growth in the web to print. And so it's being able to look at this and really understand and align the businesses for exactly how we're going to work with this. So looking at color, I had to talk a little bit about color. And I've spelt it what I would say is the wrong way, but I've been 17 years in America now, so I spell it without a U. To me, it's critical to think that industrialized printing, and this applies in all areas, is not poor quality or poor color. Industrialized printing is high quality, high color fidelity. And you can do that with the systems in place that you have. Color management really is the foundation, and we're going to leverage what we're going to do with G7. A lot of it's around standardizing, so being able to standardize, to optimize. So we're going to look at our materials and optimize. I showed that slide of the amount of print jobs that was done earlier. They spent 2 weeks optimizing their materials. If their material could not run at full rated speed, that material was not available. And again, looking at the big picture, yes, I can produce it, but do I make money doing it? No. So I want to only run at one particular speed. So optimizing all those consumables so that you know you can run at the best. Clearly go through and calibrate them. One of the biggest challenges that I see is verification. There is zero verification in a lot of cases. Profiling, I've seen it. I've been there supporting people where they've done the calibration, they've done their profiling, and they forget to do the verification. And there was a problem, because at the end of the day, there can be challenges as we go through, and is really educating. So that people have got an education that, calibration and verification is important. We're going to color manage, but my color management is my directions from Pittsburgh to my calibration and linearization is always being in Pittsburgh. My color management gets me to Toronto. If I'm so off with my initial base level that I'm in Ramsey, New Jersey, I'm not landing in Toronto then with that same color management direction. And so that's where a lot of these automation techniques have really helped drive that and make it a consistent process as we go through. Hello? Can I just have somebody talk it? There we go.
Not a problem. I also wanted to let our attendees know that if you have any questions you'd like to submit to Mark, please feel free to set them in either the Q&A and or the chat features in Zoom, and we'll address those after Mark's finished.
Okay, I'm just going to get the slides back. Of course, Microsoft crashed.
Not a problem at all.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit, and while it's making its way back, when we're looking at the color management side of things, many of the digital press manufacturers now actually have G7 inbuilt into their presses. So one of the things that you can get with this is you will actually, I know that you can pass G7 out of the box without the user operation. The press will automatically go in and make those changes as it's going on. So profiling and remote monitoring really are the key as to what we're doing with color management now. So yeah, with that, what a lot of the technologies now are moving away from that localized color management solution. So rather than using a localized solution, it's gone much more into the cloud. And so we can then monitor that from within the cloud, but also then make sure from a management perspective, I don't want to, so I'm supporting a particular customer in South Dakota. I manage that customer. I know when every measurement is done. I don't need to be there, but I know when they've done the measurements, I know whether they pass or fail, and I can provide the support back to them. So that's where we're going to do when we're going to use those technologies moving forward.
Were you able to retrieve your slide, Mark? Or?
It doesn't look to be able to. I'm just going to stop my screen share a minute so you can see my face instead.
There we go.
I'm just going to see if I can force quit PowerPoint. Okay.
Well, while it's rebooting for you, I have a question based on some of the packaging and the technology that's now around it. Are you seeing an uptake and an adoption of like NFC triggered packaging, specifically in pharma? I see that quite an uptake there, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I'm seeing an uptick in the NFC. I think a lot of the driver around that came, when we saw the difference with the iPhone actually being able to work a lot better with NFC. So I actually have just received a Print Awards entry with NFC in. So yeah, I see that NFC, for those, it's not right for every location, every package. It clearly needs to be the high value where it adds something. I think that's the thing when we're looking at this is what can it add? Mm-hmm. So it was actually quite correct that you asked that question at that particular point.
Oh, okay.
So I think the last sort of exciting thing I just wanted to touch on was what we're doing with functional printing and how we're incorporating other activities. So we got from things like the sensors, we can actually print some of these sensors so that we've got active packaging. We can start to monitor if food is going off, etc. So we can use it from that particular perspective. We have some manufacturing that we can do. RFID and NFC, what we're doing is we're leveraging those technologies. And so I would see those very much as that we're going to leverage. Nobody's going to make a fortune. We're going to get one or two companies that are going to make a fortune printing NFC. It was actually the first. So I've been talking about RFID and NFC for a very long time. RFID was the first thing I talked about when I moved over in 2004 and it really was that, from a logistics point of view is great. From a print manufacturer making a lot of money doing it, not really the realistic example. You're going to go into the size of the business isn't there, and you're in a much more of a electrical manufacturing organization at that particular point. But it's driven on that interactivity, and there's got to be a reason for it. Too much of the time I see NFC, augmented reality, there's no call to action. It's cool technology, and we're showing, look, this cool technology, but the user doesn't want to use it because they're like, yeah, it's cool, but it doesn't add anything to me, and so that's where that interactivity becomes the key. So talking on the RFID one, this is probably one of my favorite examples, talking about the user experience in there. And so this was when they first introduced RFID into ski passes. I don't ski, I have some bad knees, but apparently it's fun. And they got the RFID tags because it made the operator's life easier, but it added nothing to the consumer. So the consumer didn't want to use it. Suddenly then they go, well, if I can track the skier around the resort, then I can tell them how many feet they've skied. That's valuable information that the user wants. Suddenly everybody wants to have that because after the skiing, having a beverage, people are like, well, how many feet did you ski today? We now have apps that we can do that. So I see now 2 of my friends, they go skiing, and I see how many feet they've done with their phone apps. So these technologies are developing, but it has to be that user experience and making sure that you're managing it. QR codes. This was an example from Heinz. Was a red hot ketchup. QR code, landing page, fantastic. Forgot to keep the QR code, the landing page after the promotion ended. Wasn't probably the best thing that they could ever do. So it's managing that whole experience though as you're going through. But then it's as I say, it's that interaction with the consumer, how you're tying into that. The Penguin Frozen book really tied into that messaging about global warming as all the images disappeared as it was warmed. So you had a finite time and then you'd have to put it back into the freezer. There was a great program in Fanta interacting with social media, and Funstigator is just a great description of a program anyway. When we're looking at some of these, it's also looking at understanding where those sales conditions are. So some of these are looking at, in these cases, thermochromics. So do I want my image to appear in the sale? So where is it? Is it sold in a freezer, in a fridge, or is it not in a fridge? Do I want it to appear when the customer puts it back into the fridge in their home environment? So sort of bringing this to a close, to me, it is a great time to be in the industry. I think there's a host of innovative solutions that are out there, really leveraging around the Industry 4.0, leveraging around what we can do with that data, how we can use it, how we can make better business decisions. The processes themselves, we have those added embellishments, etc. But they're becoming democratized in how we're doing that, so that we can spend time adding value as we go through. I'm an advocate of print processes. I'm not an advocate of one print process. And each of those printing processes have their own unique characteristics. I remember being told in 1990, 91, screen printing's dead. It's going to be dead in 3 years' time. It's still a very active, viable industry. There are very unique aspects to it. Leveraging in the cloud really becomes a key as to how we're going to do this. But those data analytics really are what drive the business processes as we move forward and give us the way in which we can make informed decisions. And again, thank you to everybody for coming today. Training is the key to success. Interacting with your peers, networking as you go to these events. Hopefully later this year, we'll actually be able to meet in person and actually getting that training, getting that interaction as we go through. That's my contact info, and I apologize for the Microsoft crash. Happy to take any questions.
Fantastic. I'll wait just a little bit to see if we have any questions submitted through our attendees. Just more of a statement rather than a question, Mark, but I like how you're kind of talking about how printing is now becoming more of an actual data-driven manufacturing process than it was ever before. So harnessing that data, utilizing it for efficiencies and targeting inefficiencies with extreme prejudice and driving them out of the business process. It's fantastic.
And I think it's targeting that across the whole, but in the sales side as well. And that's, to me, is where we can really leverage nicely, is when we can start to tie in that sales. So I may have the most sales, but if I'm not being the most profitable in there, how do I change those activities as we're going through?
Perfect. I'll just ask you to unshare your screen if you may, Mike. That'd be great.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
sorry.
No, not a problem at all. Fantastic. I just wait a couple seconds to see if we have any other questions submitted. If not, I'd very much like to thank you for joining us today, Dr. Mark Bohan. I hope you found it to our attendees interesting, educational, and fun. In lieu of Dr. Bohan's generous contribution of his time and knowledge for today's presentation, a donation is being made on his behalf to the Don Gain Print Scholarship Fund. Our next webinar will be on Wednesday, April the 21st, and I'd also like to acknowledge our sponsors, who without their tremendous support, we would not have events like today possible, being Canon, EFI, HP, Konica Minolta, and Spicers as our platinum sponsors, and our gold sponsors being Adobe, Fujifilm, Graphics Canada, and Heidelberg. And thank you again to HP for providing the technology today. As mentioned, if you'd like to join the DIA, you can contact Mark McLeod or myself. And our next webinar will be Wednesday, April the 21st. And the topic will be an update on wide format production. Thanks so much. Have a great day, everyone. Take care.